Welcome to the Mark Peterson Show, the alarm clock for your brain, where we talk about business news, current events from a Blackish point of view. How many of you got a chance to see Black Panther? Loved it. Terrific movie. How many of you enjoyed the natural hairstyles that were on display in that movie? How about Shuri, Black Panther's stepsister? She was sporting those braids, right? What if in Wakanda you had to pay $1,500 or $5,000 to take a class to learn how to braid that hair and spend 30 days in a classroom learning those techniques? I bet they'd throw you out of Wakanda. Well, Wakanda is not a real place, but Tennessee is a real state, and they have those requirements for people wanting to braid natural hair. A $1,500 to $5,000 class, 30 plus days in a classroom in order to do what people have been doing for hundreds of years in the Black community, braiding hair. Tennessee, since they have passed the legislation, has fined upwards of $100,000 to unlicensed natural hair shops. In fact, one natural hair shop was fined $16,000, and the owner is on a monthly payment plan of about $850 a month to pay that fine off for braiding her natural hair. Now, to Tennessee's credit, you do have some rational politicians who've stepped forward and have tried to strike down this legislation. House Bill 1809 was put out back in February of this year to make it so that individuals who wanted to braid natural hair did not need a license to do so. Believe it or not, it was the Black barbers, stylists, and cosmetologists who stood with this legislation, claiming that if you strike it down, you would kill their livelihood. On Monday of this week, March 18, 2018, Mark Norris, one of the sponsors of the bill that would have struck down this legislation, withdrew it because of the opposition from natural hairstylists, barbers, and cosmetologists in the state. The bill was opposed by State Representative Antonio Parkinson, who claimed that if the bill had passed, people would get disease and infections from unlicensed natural hairstylists. Now let's go over this again. In Tennessee, to get a license, you have to go to just one of 3 certified schools in Tennessee, spend somewhere between $1,500 and $5,000 on a class that will teach you how to braid. Coursework requires you to be there for 300 plus hours to get that certification. That's over a month. 1/12 of a year out of your life to get a license to braid natural hair. Now, currently, believe it or not, there are 32 other states that require a license to braid. Now, is this really warranted? Not even officials in Tennessee think it's warranted. According to Brian McCormick, the Tennessee Deputy Commissioner, he thought this was an overreach and stood in support of legislation to strike down the licensing. He stated that since 2010, there have only been 2 complaints about unlicensed natural hair stylists when it came to the services that they provided. In a deeper study of 17 jurisdictions outside of Tennessee over the same time period, they only found 11 complaints, 9 of which were unwarranted. So in Tennessee and in 17 jurisdictions outside of Tennessee, we couldn't find any compelling reason, health or otherwise, that would say licensing is required for braiding hair. But yet and still, the school providers of the course, the barbers, the cosmetologists, and even the natural hair stylist stood in support of the bill because it protected their quote-unquote livelihood. Well, I guess you can tell by the sarcastic tone in my voice, I hate it. As I mentioned, there are 32 states that have some legislation that require this. Legislating natural hair. Now, I could take the tack to say, the federal government is coming after black people. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think they're greedy people who want to set up artificial barriers to trade. And this is a good target, but it goes deeper than that. And I'm going to get real deep with this in a minute to tell you why I hate stuff like this. But before I do that, I want to tell you the states where you can go and braid hair and you don't need a license. Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, my home state of Georgia, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Michigan, Mississippi, Nebraska, Utah, Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia. Now, Florida, Minnesota, Oregon, and South Carolina have a requirement, but they only require a 2 to 3 day course and a $25 registration fee. Very minimal hurdle. The remainder of the 32 states have restrictions that are either specific to braiding or they lump braiding in with all the other licensing requirements for cosmetology or beauticians. Okay, you're sitting there thinking, this is crazy, if you think like me. Why is the government, state or local, supporting legislation that's taking the opportunity for people to make money and making it extremely difficult? You can't braid at home and have a home-based business if you don't have this license, and you can't do it in a unlicensed shop, even if you have a storefront and you're licensed to do other types of hairstyles in those shops. Sounds like an overreach. Sounds like a restriction of trade to me. But it goes further than that. To me, it goes a lot further than that. Let's talk about some of the reasons why I hate this legislation. First, it hurts competition. According to Forbes, Mississippi has the same size black population as Tennessee. Tennessee has 150 natural hair shops. Mississippi has 2,600 natural hair shops. Mississippi requires their natural hair providers to register with the Department of Health and pay a $25 fee. So the issues around whether or not unlicensed individuals or people who aren't certified to provide braiding services because of health reasons is moot in Tennessee because they have to register with the health department and are subject to inspections. So why such a high barrier in Tennessee? Because of the streamlined process in Mississippi, shops are leaving Tennessee and flocking to Mississippi, and I would too. The Tennessee legislation is actually harming the constituents. So State Representative Antonio Parkinson, who stood with those who supported the existing legislation, is hurting his constituents. They're paying higher prices because of less competition in the face of growing demand for natural hairstyles like braiding. Give that man an economics book. Tell him to watch CNBC and listen to the discussions about the ongoing tariffs for aluminum and steel. And see how those markets are playing out and how they're going to hurt the long-term economic outlook. And Tennessee is already seeing it. Business flight is not a good thing. Restriction of competition is not a great thing for consumers. And let me tell you something else about consumers. They're smart. They know a bad hairstyle from a good hairstyle. And they know a good hairstylist from a bad hairstylist. Those who are unsanitary and don't provide a good product will be out of business. Trust me, I know that. I grew up in Alabama, one of the states that has a restriction or a registration requirement for natural hairstylists. And there are people who provide services out of their house. There's one lady who sells plates every Friday. She'll make up all this great food, and she's a terrific cook, like other women in the neighborhood. She gets absolutely no business because she has 15 cats. Nobody will buy her delicious food because they look at that scenario and it screams unsanitary. Consumers aren't stupid. They just want the market forces to work in favor of them so that they can get the services they want at a market-driven price. And Tennessee is not allowing that. What's the second reason why I hate this legislation? There's no logic. The pretense that they're making that without certification, without a license, these people will spread infections. Okay. 11 filed complaints in 7 years, 9 of them unwarranted, says there's no threat. That's not me saying it. That's the state of Tennessee, your health board and your licensing board saying that, as they support legislation to strike down the licensing requirements. So it's a pretense. It's a pretense. If you're concerned about the consumer, why haven't these same groups tried to ban hair straightening products? You know, the stuff you put in your hair to relax it, to make it straight, or the Jerry curl. When I was in college, I started a business selling health and beauty aid products to New England area colleges where those did not exist. Because that part of the country, Maine, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, is less than 1% black. But you have a lot of black students at colleges. I saw that as an opportunity. So I sold a lot of hair relaxers And I'm not going to tell you that I even use some on myself, but I use some on myself. So I know how painful those lye-based products can be if you keep them in your hair too long. Can they burn your scalp? Yes. Can they get in your eye? Absolutely. Are there probably more complaints for those products than they are for natural hair stylists doing braids? Dollars to donuts, yes. So why are they trying to stop people from using those products at home or in home-based businesses? Because they see an opportunity for a money grab and to distort the market. And that's just now how it should work. State Representative Antonio Parkinson shouldn't work that way. Politicians should be leaders, and even in the face of overwhelming illogical support for bad legislation, you should stand against it. The goal is not to get reelected, it's to lead. And not to lead people off a cliff. So there's no logic to that legislation. Those are two very good reasons, in my opinion, to call up the state representatives and push for that legislation to be overturned. But my third reason is the reason that scares me the most. And it's the reason why everyone listening to this podcast, black, white, or other, should care about this issue. Because some of you listening to it said, I don't have natural hair, I don't have black hair, this is not my concern. Yes, it is. When local, state, or federal governments get to a point where they are legislating your life to this degree, to make it easier for larger corporations to manage how you spend your money, to control your budgets to the point where you have no financial freedom, you should care. You should care. That's why this show is called The Alarm Clock for Your Brain, because I'm going to wake you up. Do you want large farmers to tell you that you can't have a home garden? Now you're waking up. Because it's happening already. In 2014, Michigan banned backyard farming for homes and for slightly larger farms. That meant they couldn't have chickens, beehives, goats in those farms where they had them previously. And many of these small to medium-sized urban farmers supplied co-ops in Michigan. So what happened when the legislation went into effect? Where did the co-ops have to go to get their goods? Large corporate farmers. Where did the home farmers, the home-based farms, go to get their food? Corporate chains or higher price co-op food. They could no longer provide food out of their backyard to make their budgets meet and balance. Iowa, Florida, Louisiana, they banned front yard gardening, which is the fastest growing trend to keep the food out your front yard. Now, as I told you, I grew up in Alabama, Marengo County and Dallas County. My grandmother was a farmer, and so was my grandfather. I guess they would be if they're grandfather. They were married. Grandmother had a huge garden. She called it a small garden, but it was over 2 acres in size. Everything in the front yard you could think of. Goats, chickens, pigs, and then a huge garden. Corn, peas, tomatoes, you name it. It was what you would call a poor community, but no one went hungry. because she provided food to dozens of families at decent prices that they could then feed their families, and she could use the money to finance that cycle all over again. What happens when those types of people can't do that anymore? Well, we know what happens. In Oklahoma, officials entered the yard of Denise Morrison without her permission and pulled up her garden and threw away the vegetables. She attempted to sue, but the case was thrown out because the courts argued they had given her notice about her garden. The notice was you could have a garden as long as the plants weren't over 12 inches in height and contained food that was edible, all of which she complied with. And yet they destroyed the garden anyway, claiming she had violated the statute. You're waking up now? It's not just about braiding hair. If local hairstylists in Tennessee, barbers and cosmetologists can get away with saying bad legislation needs to stay in place because it protects my livelihood, why can't corporate farmers say the same thing? What if bottled water companies came to you and said, you can't collect rainwater? You can't harvest rainwater. That's our livelihood. If you do that and provide your own water, what are we going to do? You have to buy from us. That's not fair. Sounds illogical, doesn't it? When you look at it like that. But there are several states out there already that have restrictions on rainwater harvesting. Colorado, they had the most restrictive requirements from a bill passed in 2002, though they relaxed it in 2016 when they allowed people to start collecting roof surface water. So water that would hit your roof and drain off. But any other collections, open containers in your backyard to collect rainwater, are strictly prohibited. Oregon, again, only allows roof surface water collection. In 2012, they arrested a 64-year-old man for collecting water with open containers in his backyard. Ohio allows the collection of water for potable purposes, but they have very strict requirements on how you can collect it, making it extremely difficult for people to do so. Nevada, you actually have to get permission from the state and prove that you're using it for beneficial purposes. In Utah, my buddies in Utah, they go one step further. They actually claim the state owns all the water. Yeah. The state says they own the rainwater, and you can ask for permission to collect it. Now, if you receive a permit, which can only be granted after a state engineer comes out to approve the collection, then you're allowed to collect up to 2,500 gallons. And individuals who do not have a permit are allowed to collect up to 100 gallons. Exceed those limits, and they will gladly fine you and or arrest you. Braiding hair now seems not so funny. seems like more stupid legislation that has a theme to it. That all the things that you can do, that you thought you could do in a free and open society to live your life without harm to neighbor or self, are slowly but surely being restricted. So, where do we go from here? Well, I am going to follow up on this legislation because I have learned, as I mentioned in the opening, that this legislation did not pass. The bill 1809. And we have to push back against those sorts of items. Push back against bad legislation. And that's what I plan to do. Tune in to the next episode and get an additional update on where we go from here. Thank you for listening to the Mark Peterson Show. And remember that this is the alarm clock for your brain, waking you up and turning you on to issues that are going to help you build wealth in your life and freedom to live in an open and free society. I'm Audi 5000.